The secondary cooling loop on the Odyssey had been leaking for 3 weeks. A slow, rhythmic drip of coolant hitting the deck plates that sounded like a funeral drum in the oppressive quiet of the cockpit. Elson Quarry didn't fix it. He didn't have the spare parts, and he didn't have the energy. He sat in the command chair, his spine molded into the worn synthetic leather, watching the tactical display flicker with a persistent, low-voltage stutter. The ship was 42 years old, a repurposed geological surveyor that had been stripped of its scanners and fitted with a jury-rigged cloaking field that smelled of scorched insulation and desperation. It was a vessel designed to find minerals in quiet asteroids, now tasked with carrying the soul of a dying species into the mouth of a god. Liren Swayon, the navigator, didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at him since they cleared the Oort cloud. Her hands moved over the glass interface with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon performing an autopsy. She was 30 years his junior, born into the era of the Great Scarcity, where the air you breathed was taxed and the water you drank had passed through 1,000 bladders before it reached your lips. She represented everything the human alliance had left, efficiency born of starvation. The mission was a lie. Elson knew it, Liren knew it, and the high command in their bunker under the Andes certainly knew it. The Xylos had demanded a fleet of subjection. They had sent a mathematical ultimatum through the subspace relays, a sequence of prime numbers that translated into a simple, brutal geometric progression: surrender or erasure. They expected 1,000 warships, a grand display of fealty from a conquered neighbor. They expected a civilization that still had the strength to bow. Instead, they got Elson Quarry and a ship that vibrated whenever the life support cycled. The Alliance's decision had been reached in a room that lacked enough power for proper lighting. Elson had watched via a grainy, delayed holographic feed as Chancellor Eris laid out the logistics of their extinction. The Alliance had exactly 12 functioning capital ships left, all of them guarding the atmospheric processors of Earth and Mars. To send them was to leave the remaining billions to suffocate in the dark. To keep them was to watch them burn when the Xylo fleet arrived. "We will send one," Aris had whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "One ship to tell them we are more than the sum of our scrap metal." It was a philosophical gamble played with a deck of missing cards. The Odyssey had been outfitted with a signal booster designed to mimic the subspace signature of a much larger vessel, but the hardware was unstable. If Elson pushed the engines too hard, the ship would literally shake itself into atoms before they even reached the Synthera system. The transition from hyperspace was not a smooth glide, it was a violent extraction. The Odyssey tumbled back into real space with a groan of protesting titanium that vibrated through Elson's teeth. His vision blurred, the sudden return of gravity pinning him against the seat. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic, high-pitched whine of the inertial dampeners trying to compensate for a 6-degree deviance in the jump exit. "Contact," Liren said, her voice a flat line of professional detachment. "Range, 400,000 kilometers, multiple signatures." Elson wiped a thin trail of sweat from his brow. The copper tang of recycled oxygen burnt his throat. He looked at the primary screen. The Synthera system was a masterpiece of cold celestial engineering. And surrounding its inner moon was the Xylo response. It wasn't a fleet. It was a cage. 347 ships, each one a jagged obsidian needle over 5 kilometers long. They didn't use visible thrusters. They hung in the void, held by gravitational tethers that warped the starlight around them. They were beautiful, terrifying, and utterly indifferent to the single rattling speck of dust that had just appeared on their doorstep. The comms board lit up. A frequency so precise it bypassed the Odyssey's encryption protocols as if they didn't exist. A voice, synthesized and layered with 1,000 harmonic overtones, filled the bridge. "Humanity," the voice began, cold as the space between galaxies. "You were commanded to present your fleet for decommissioning. We detect a single hull. Identify." Elson felt the weight of 10 billion lives pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He gripped the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a man who had spent his life hauling ice from the rings of Saturn. A man who knew the cost of a broken seal and the value of a steady hand. "This is Commander Elson Quarry of the Odyssey," he said, his voice sounding small against the backdrop of the Xylo Armada. representing the human alliance. There was a pause, a silence that lasted exactly 12 seconds, during which Elson could hear the blood rushing through his ears. In that silence, he imagined the Xylo sensors peeling back the layers of his ship, seeing the patched hull, the leaking coolant, the two terrified primates huddled in a tin can. "Where is the remainder of your force?" the Xylo voice asked. Valzeth, the negotiator prime, was now speaking directly to him. "Our calculations indicated a 98% probability of a full military surrender. Why do you send a grain of sand to meet an ocean?" Elson looked at Lyran. She was staring at her console, her face a mask of cold terror. He realized then that the Xylos didn't understand the concept of a bluff. They were creatures of pure logic, of absolute ratios. To them, a single ship was a mathematical error. "You wanted to see our strength, Valzeth," Elson said, leaning forward. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger. It was the anger of a man who had been told to do the impossible with nothing. The anger of a species that had been pushed into a corner of the galaxy and told to die quietly. "You expected a fleet because you think power is something you can count. You think strength is a matter of tonnage and kinetic yield." He paused, letting the static of the open channel hum. "We didn't send a fleet because we didn't need one. Everything the Alliance is, everything we have ever been, is on this ship. You asked for our surrender. I'm here to tell you that you've misunderstood the nature of the transaction." On the tactical map, 3 of the obsidian needles detached from their formation and began a slow, predatory burn toward the Odyssey. They moved with a terrifying grace, closing the distance of 400,000 kilometers with a speed that defied conventional physics. Elson's heart hammered against his ribs. He was looking at his own death, reflected in the cold sensors of an alien god. The sensors on the Odyssey began to scream, a low, rhythmic pulse indicating a target lock from weapons that could crack a planet's crust. "Explain your presence, Commander." Valzeth's voice returned, now tinged with something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps just the clinical interest of a biologist looking at a new strain of bacteria. "Why have you come alone to the seat of our power?" Elson took a deep breath, the stale, metallic air filling his lungs. He thought of the Chancellor in his dark room. He thought of the billions of people back home, waiting for a signal that would never come, or a fire that would end everything. "Because," Elson said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, "a fleet is a target, a fleet is a plan, a fleet is predictable. But one ship is an idea, and you can't kill an idea with a railgun." He hit a sequence on his console, engaging the signal booster. The Odyssey groaned as the experimental hardware drew massive amounts of power from the primary reactor. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, red glare of the emergency backups. The ship began to shake, a deep, bone-rattling vibration that suggested the hull was seconds away from catastrophic failure. On the Xylo scanners, the Odyssey would now appear to be expanding. The signal booster was vomiting a chaotic mess of electronic signatures, ghosting the ship across 1,000 different points in space. To the Xylo logic, the single ship was becoming a blurred, impossible swarm. "We are here to negotiate." "Valzeth," Elson said through the rattling of his teeth. "But we aren't here to beg. You want to see what a human is capable of when he has nothing left to lose? Look at your screens. We are everywhere. And we are nowhere." The 3 Xylo warships halted their advance. Their gravitational drives flared as they attempted to process the sudden, impossible data bloom coming from the Odyssey. For the first time in their history, the Xylos were facing an anomaly they couldn't calculate. Lyran looked up from her console, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. "The reactor is redlining, Elson," she whispered. "We have 5 minutes before the core melts through the floor." Elson didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on the obsidian giants outside his window. "5 minutes is plenty of time for a conversation," he replied. The bridge was filled with the smell of ozone and the sound of a ship dying. But in that moment, for the first time in his life, Elson Quarry felt the true, terrifying weight of what it meant to be human. They were a species of gamblers, of liars, and of survivors. And the game had only just begun. The deck plates beneath Elson's boots hummed with a frantic, uneven frequency. a mechanical death rattle that crawled up through his shins and settled in the marrow of his bones. The signal booster was no longer just a piece of hardware. It had become a parasite, draining the Odyssey's lifeblood to feed a lie. On the tactical display, the 347 Xylo ships remained as motionless as obsidian tombstones, their sensor arrays likely struggling to reconcile the impossible data blooming from a single decaying hull. Lyran Swayan's fingers were a blur of motion against the glass, her face bathed in the harsh, rhythmic crimson of the emergency lighting. She wasn't just navigating anymore. She was performing a high-wire act with the ship's power grid, shunting energy from the secondary life support and the internal gravity generators just to keep the ghost signals flickering. The gravity in the cockpit dipped and surged, making Elson feel momentarily weightless before slamming him back into the worn synthetic leather of his seat. "Internal temperature is rising," Lyran said, her voice strained but surgically precise. 42 degrees Celsius and climbing. The coolant from the secondary loop is flash steaming against the reactor housing. If the pressure isn't vented in the next 4 minutes, the bulkhead will buckle. Elson didn't look at the gauges. He didn't need to. He could smell the ship's agony, the scent of ionized dust and the scorched, sweet aroma of melting wire insulation. It reminded him of the old foundries in the belt, the places where men worked until their lungs were coated in gray soot, just to keep the atmospheric processors of Mars from seizing. It was the smell of a civilization that had forgotten how to build and had only learned how to patch. The Xylo frequency crackled again, the voice of Valzeth losing some of its synthetic perfectness. There was a jagged edge to the translation now, a hint of processing lag as the alien intelligence grappled with the anomaly. "Commander Quarry," the voice resonated, vibrating the very air in the cockpit. "Our observers report a physical divergence. Your vessel is undergoing structural degradation. The signatures we detect are inconsistent with the mass of a single hull. Explain the contradiction. Our logic dictates that you are either a vanguard or a deception." Elson leaned into the comms pickup, his throat parched. "We are a paradox, Valzeth. That's the problem with your math. You calculated for a fleet of ships, but you never factored in the weight of a choice. We chose to come here. We chose to stand in front of your guns with nothing but a prayer and a signal booster." He looked at the tactical map. The 3 Xylo ships that had halted their advance were beginning to pivot. They weren't retreating. They were repositioning for a multispectral sweep. They were going to peel back the layers of the electronic noise like a surgeon removing a tumor. "Lyran, give me the feed from the long-range array," Elson commanded. The display flickered, showing a grainy, distorted view of the space behind them. It was empty. There was no rescue coming, no hidden fleet waiting in the shadow of a gas giant. There was only the cold, indifferent vacuum and the distant, fading light of a sun that belonged to a species on the brink of erasure. Then, a new icon appeared on the edge of the sensor sweep. It wasn't a Xylo ship. It was a high-frequency burst coming from the direction of Earth, encoded in a cipher Elson hadn't seen since his days in the Naval Intelligence Reserves. It was a tight beam transmission, narrow enough to slip through the Xylo interference. Lyran intercepted it, her brow furrowed. "It's a handshake protocol, Elson. From the Alliance. But it's not for us." "What do you mean it's not for us?" Elson asked, his heart skipping a beat against his ribs. "It's an automated trigger," she whispered, her eyes wide as she read the scrolling data. "The signal booster." "Elson, the hardware wasn't designed just to mimic a fleet. It has a secondary function. It's a tactical beacon. It's broadcasting our exact telemetry, the Xylo orbital patterns, and their gravitational signatures back to the Alliance's remaining orbital platforms." Elson felt a cold wave of realization wash over him, sharper and more biting than the heat of the cockpit. The mission wasn't a bluff. It was a target painting exercise. The Chancellor hadn't sent the Odyssey to negotiate or to scare the Xylos. He had sent them to act as a sacrificial sensor array. The signal booster was drawing so much power because it was mapping the entire Xylo defensive grid, using the Odyssey as a disposable probe. "They lied to us," Elson said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. "They didn't send us to be an idea. They sent us to be a flare." He thought of Chancellor Eris in that dimly lit room, the way his voice had cracked. It hadn't been grief for the species. It had been the weight of the betrayal. The Alliance wasn't planning to surrender. They were planning a desperate, final strike using the few heavy-yield kinetic slugs they had left, and they needed a precise lock on the Xylo command ships. A lock that could only be obtained by someone standing right in the middle of the hornet's nest. Elson, Lyran's voice broke the silence, more human than he had ever heard it. The Xylos have stopped their scans. They've detected the tight beam transmission. On the main screen, the 3 obsidian needles suddenly flared with a terrifying violet light. The gravitational tethers snapped taut, and the ships surged forward with a predatory intent that bypassed all negotiation. They were no longer curious. They were reacting to a threat. Commander Quarry, Valzeth's voice boomed, no longer calm. You are a component of a weapons system. You have introduced a hostile variable into this theater. Decommission your vessel immediately or face total molecular dissipation. The Odyssey groaned as a localized gravitational pulse hit the hull, shearing off one of the external sensor masts. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the bridge. The air pressure began to drop as a hairline fracture opened in the aft compartment. Elson looked at Loren. She was holding her breath, her hand hovering over the manual scuttle switch. They were trapped between 2 fires. If they stayed, the Xylos would vaporize them. If they shut down the booster to save themselves, the Alliance would lose the lock, and the final hope of a strike would vanish into the dark. It was the classic human dilemma, the kind Elson had seen 1,000 times in the ice-hauling business. Do you save the crew, or do you save the cargo? Except this time, the cargo was the survival of 8 billion souls, and the crew was just a tired man and a girl who had never seen a clear blue sky. The heat was becoming unbearable now, the oxygen scrubbers failing as the power was diverted to the dying booster. Elson could feel the sweat stinging his eyes. He looked at the countdown on the reactor core. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Lyran, he said, his voice steadying. If we cut the booster, can we jump? Not with the reactor in this state, she replied, her voice trembling. The moment we try to cycle the drive, the core will turn us into a nebula. We're anchored here, Elson. Then we finish the job, Elson said, reaching forward and locking the signal booster's output to maximum. If we're going to be a flare, let's make sure we're the brightest damn thing in the galaxy. He overrode the safety protocols, his fingers dancing over the keys with a frantic, desperate rhythm. He wasn't just boosting the signal anymore. He was slaving the ship's entire remaining fuel reserves into the emitter. The Odyssey began to glow on the Xylo sensors, a blinding sun of data that washed out everything else in the system. In the distance, across the vast emptiness of the solar system, 12 massive railguns on the dark side of the moon began to swivel, guided by the pinpoint accuracy of the dying ship's transmission. But then, the tactical display chirped a warning that made Elson's blood run cold. One of the Xylo ships wasn't targeting the Odyssey. It was moving toward a civilian transport lane, its weapons charging for a retaliatory strike against a target far more vulnerable than a single broken surveyor. Valzeth spoke one last time, his voice a chilling executioner's whisper. If you choose to be a weapon commander, we shall choose a target of equal value. Your world is fragile. We are not. Elson stared at the screen, the weight of his decision crushing the air out of his lungs. He had painted the target, but he had also pulled the trigger on his own people. As the violet light of the Xylo weapons reached its peak, a shadow fell over the Odyssey, a ship even larger than the others, moving with the slow, inevitable grace of an eclipse. It wasn't attacking. It was positioning itself between the Odyssey and the Xylo fleet, its massive hull absorbing the data burst. "They're blocking the signal," Lyran cried. "We're losing the lock." Elson gripped the armrests of his chair. The reactor core hit the 1-minute mark. Through the forward viewport, he saw the massive alien vessel open a docking bay, a yawning maw of white light and cold geometry. It wasn't a gesture of war. It was a forced extraction. They weren't being destroyed. They were being taken. And as the Odyssey was pulled into the belly of the beast, Elson Quarry realized that the Xylos weren't just interested in the ship. They were interested in the man who had the audacity to lie to a god. The transition from the violent, bone-shaking scream of the reactor to the absolute magnetic stillness of the Xylo docking bay was a physical assault. It wasn't the silence of the void, but a heavy, pressurized hum that resonated in the fillings of Elson's teeth. The Odyssey groaned one last time, a long metallic sigh of a ship that had finally given up its ghost. The primary lights had flickered out, leaving the bridge submerged in a dim, sickly amber glow from the backup chemical cells. Elson's hands were slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and cold sweat as he clawed at the manual override for the ventral thrusters. He wasn't trying to fly, he was trying to detonate. If he could force a fuel bleed into the ignition chamber, he could turn the Odyssey into a localized sun, taking a piece of the Xylo mothership with them. The console didn't beep. It didn't protest. It simply stayed dead. The Xylo dampening field had bypassed the ship's breakers, turning the Odyssey into a coffin of inert titanium. Lyran was slumped over the navigation array, her breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. A jagged shard of the glass interface had caught her across the forearm when the gravitational pulse hit, and the scent of iron began to mingle with the thick, suffocating smell of burnt lithium. "We can't just sit here," Elson hissed, his voice cracking. He reached beneath his seat and pulled out a manual diagnostic slab, its screen cracked but still glowing with a faint, ghostly blue light. "If I can bypass the magnetic lock on the emergency atmospheric vents, I can trigger a high-pressure burst. It might not kill them, but it'll blow the docking clamps. We'll tumble back into the vacuum. At least we'll be a moving target again." He didn't wait for her answer. He dropped to the deck plates, his knees barking in protest as he hit the cold metal. He pried open the maintenance hatch near the floor, the smell of ancient grease and ionized dust wafting up from the ship's bowels. His fingers searched for the manual release cables, his touch frantic. Outside the viewport, the Xylo hangar was a cathedral of obsidian and violet light. It was so vast that the Odyssey looked like a speck of dust trapped in the throat of a leviathan. There were no visible guards, no soldiers in pressurized suits. There was only the shifting of massive, geometric plates and the rhythmic pulse of energy fields that felt like the heartbeat of a god. Elson found the cable. It was a thick braided wire coated in a layer of grime from 4 decades of neglect. He wrapped it around his gloved hand and pulled with every ounce of strength his aging frame possessed. A sharp, electric snap echoed through the bridge. A surge of feedback, a gift from the Xylo dampening field, shot up the cable. Elson's body jerked as 40,000 volts of static energy arced through his nervous system. He was thrown backward, his head slamming against the base of the command chair. For a moment, the world was nothing but a white, searing blur. The smell of singed hair and ozone, the real caustic ozone of a short circuit, filled his nostrils. He tried to move, but his right arm felt like it belonged to a stranger, heavy and unresponsive. His vision slowly tunneled back into focus, and he saw Lyran looking down at him, her face a mask of pale terror. "The heat is staying in," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the alien ship. "The cooling fans died. We're in a heat sink, Elson. The Xylo ship is absorbing our thermal radiation, but it's reflecting the infrared back into the hull. We're being cooked." The temperature on the bridge had climbed to 55 degrees Celsius. The air was thick, like breathing through a wet wool blanket. Every breath was a struggle against the rising tide of carbon dioxide. Then, a new sound cut through the internal misery. It was a high-pitched, melodic chime, completely alien in its structure. It wasn't coming from the comms. It was coming from the ship's own internal speakers, a system that should have been dead. "The signal booster," Lyran gasped, pointing at the flickering tactical display. "Look." The device they had used to paint the target was no longer broadcasting to the Alliance. It had been hijacked. The Xylos were using the Odyssey's own hardware to run a diagnostic of the human mind. On the screen, thousands of lines of code were scrolling upward, but they weren't in any language Elson recognized. They were shapes, evolving geometries that seemed to shift and change based on the rhythm of his own pulse. A distorted voice, echoing with the static of 1,000 broken frequencies, filled the bridge. It wasn't Valzeth this time. It was a chorus of voices, some human, some synthesized, all layered into a terrifying harmony. "Commander Quarry," the chorus sang, "you have provided the data we required. You are a fascinating specimen of entropic logic. You burn your own house to light a path for an army that cannot see." Elson forced himself up, his left hand gripping the edge of the console for support. The static burn on his right side was beginning to throb with a dull, insistent heat. He looked at the scrolling shapes on the screen. He realized with a jolt of horror that the Xylos weren't just reading the ship's data. They were downloading the Odyssey's entire history. Every log entry, every personal message Elson had ever sent, every medical record of every crew member who had ever walked these decks. They're harvesting us, Elson realized. They didn't stop the signal because they were afraid of the railguns. They stopped it because they wanted the source. He looked at Lyran. She was pale, her eyes fixed on a specific section of the data stream. Elson followed her gaze and felt his heart freeze. The Xylos had found the encrypted core, the section of the computer that held the coordinates for the Alliance's civilian refugees, the deep crust bunkers on Mars, and the hidden stations in the Jovian clouds. Lyran. The Purge, Elson commanded, the words feeling like shards of glass in his dry throat. We have to wipe the core. Now. She shook her head, her hands hovering over a console that refused to respond. I can't. The Xylo override is absolute. It's like trying to fight the tide with a spoon. If I try to force a hard reset, the power surge will bypass the shielding and vent the remaining oxygen through the secondary seals. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. If I wipe the data, we die in 90 seconds. If I don't, they find everyone. It was a math problem with no right answer. 8 billion lives against 2. The logic was simple, the kind of logic the Xylos would admire. But as Elson looked at Lyran, a girl who had spent her life in the dark, dreaming of a sky she would never see, the logic felt like a betrayal of everything it meant to be alive. He looked at the manual release for the oxygen scrubbers. It was located on the far side of the bridge, behind a bulkhead that was already glowing cherry red from the thermal buildup. To reach it, he would have to crawl through a corridor of searing metal, exposing himself to lethal levels of radiant heat. Do it, Elson said, his voice dropping to a low, jagged growl. Wipe the core. I'll get to the manual scrubber. I can buy us a few extra minutes. You won't make it across the deck, Lyran said, her voice trembling. The gravity is fluctuating. You'll be pinned. Then I'll die trying, Elson replied. It's better than sitting here waiting for them to finish the download. He didn't give her a chance to argue. He threw himself toward the corridor, his boots slipping on the slick deck. The heat hit him like a physical wall, a solid weight that tried to push the air back into his lungs. He could smell his own flight suit beginning to singe, the synthetic fabric curling and turning black. He reached the bulkhead, his hands hovering inches away from the glowing metal. He used the hem of his jacket to grip the release lever. With a roar of agony, he wrenched it downward. The sound of rushing air filled the bridge, not the life-giving flow of oxygen, but the terrifying whistle of a vacuum leak. Lyran had initiated the purge. The Odyssey's computer screamed a final digital death cry as its memory banks were incinerated by a localized EMP. The Xylo chorus cut off abruptly. The violet lights in the hangar shifted to a harsh, blinding white. Elson collapsed against the bulkhead, his hands a mass of blisters, his breath coming in short, panicked stabs. He looked through the viewport one last time. The massive obsidian plates of the Xylo ship were moving. They weren't just docking anymore. They were closing in, the hangar shrinking as the alien vessel began to compress the space around the Odyssey. They weren't being taken to a cell. They were being integrated. The Xylo ship was literally swallowing the Odyssey, fusing the human metal with its own alien geometry. Through the haze of pain and the thinning air, Elson saw a shape appearing in the center of the bridge. It wasn't a physical entity, but a projection, a shimmering, three-dimensional map of the solar system. It centered on Earth, but the image was wrong. The continents were shifted, the oceans a different shade of blue. It was Earth as it had been 10,000 years ago. The voice returned, but it was different now. It was singular. It was Valzeth. You have destroyed the map, Commander. The voice resonated through the very structure of Elson's bones. You have chosen silence over submission. It is a primitive response, born of a fear of the unknown. You believe you are protecting your kind. The projection of the ancient Earth began to burn. But you have only ensured that when we find them, and we will find them, there will be no one left to explain the paradox. The floor beneath Elson's feet suddenly vanished. He wasn't falling, he was being pulled upward, caught in a beam of light so intense it stripped the shadows from the room. He saw Lyran being lifted as well, her hand reaching out for him, her mouth open in a silent scream. As they were pulled into the ceiling of the bridge, the Odyssey finally buckled. The hull collapsed inward, crushed by the sheer gravitational weight of the Xylo ship. In the final moment before the darkness took him, Elson didn't think of the Alliance or the railguns on the moon. He thought of the leaking coolant in the cockpit, the rhythmic drip-drip-drip that had been the heartbeat of his final days. He realized that the Xylos hadn't brought them here to talk. They had brought them here to be the first pieces of a new collection. The light swallowed him, and the silence that followed was the heaviest thing he had ever known. The sensation of being pulled through the ceiling was not one of movement, but of unfolding. Gravity didn't lift Elson. It simply ceased to have a consistent direction, leaving his inner ear screaming in a void of equilibrium. Then came the cold. It was a sterile, absolute chill that didn't bite the skin so much as it slowed the pulse, a temperature designed for the preservation of delicate circuitry, rather than the survival of carbon-based life. When his vision finally cleared, the amber glow of the Odyssey was gone, replaced by a vastness that defied the internal dimensions of any ship he had ever known. He was suspended in a cage of fractured light, a hexagonal prism of translucent matter that hummed with the same frequency as his own nervous system. 10 feet away, Lyran Swyon hung in a similar cell. She was conscious, her eyes wide and darting, but her mouth moved in a silence that suggested the very air between them had been programmed to ignore sound. There was no floor. Beneath them lay a chasm of shifting geometries, titanic obsidian plates sliding over one another like the scales of a planetary serpent. This was the marrow of the Xylo mothership, a place where physics was a suggestion and logic was a decorative element. Commander Quarry. The voice didn't come from the air. It resonated inside Elson's skull, vibrating against his frontal lobe. It wasn't Valzeth's chorus this time. It was a single, clinical entity. "You are currently being translated," the voice continued. "Your biological markers are being converted into a persistent informational state. It is a necessary precaution. Raw matter is too volatile for the deeper layers of our consensus." Elson tried to speak, but his tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. He forced a breath, his lungs burning with the over-oxygenated, recycled atmosphere of the chamber. You said we were a paradox. Why keep a paradox?" "Because a paradox is a flaw in the system," the voice responded. "And a flaw must be understood before it can be corrected. You believe your mission was one of sacrifice. You believe your Alliance sent you here as a gamble." A shimmering pane of light drifted toward Elson, stopping inches from his face. It wasn't a screen. It was a window into a data stream he wasn't meant to see. Images began to flicker at a speed that should have been nauseating, but the Xylo interface was forcing his brain to process the frames with artificial clarity. He saw the Andean bunker. He saw Chancellor Eris, but the man didn't look weary or defeated. He was standing in a clean, high-tech facility that Elson didn't recognize, a place with power to spare, and air that didn't smell like decay. Eris was speaking to a figure hidden in the shadows, a figure whose proportions were subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The transmission date was 6 months prior to the Xylo ultimatum. The realization hit Elson with the force of a decompression event. The ultimatum wasn't a surprise. It was a scheduled event. The human alliance hadn't been backed into a corner. They had negotiated the terms of their own subjection half a year before the first Xylo ship entered the solar system. The Odyssey wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a flare. It was a delivery mechanism. "Look closer, Commander," the voice urged, the tone almost pitying. The data stream shifted to the Odyssey's cargo manifest. Beneath the false sensors, beneath the jury-rigged signal booster, there was a secondary hull layer Elson had never checked. Within that layer sat a biological payload, a viral suppression string designed not to kill the Xylos, but to synchronize with their consensus network. "The Alliance didn't send a ship to save humanity," Elson whispered, the words finally breaking through the silence of his cell. "They sent a key. They wanted to join you, not as subjects, but as an integrated component of your machine." "Correct," the voice confirmed. Your leaders offered the biomass of your species in exchange for a seat in the consensus. They provided the coordinates of the civilian refugees as a gesture of good faith. They intended for the Odyssey to arrive and initiate a handshake protocol that would bypass our defensive firewalls. But you purged the core, the voice added. And for the first time, Elson detected a ripple of something like genuine interest. You destroyed the very coordinates your leaders had traded for their own immortality. You committed an act of treason against a surrender that was already finalized. Elson looked over at Lyran. She had stopped moving. Her gaze was fixed on the chasm below, where a single massive obsidian pillar was rising toward them. The weight of the betrayal was a physical pressure, a cold, leaden ball in his stomach. The men he had served, the flag he had carried into the dark, it was all a shell game. The 12 capital ships guarding Earth weren't there to fight. They were the personal transports for the Chancellor and his inner circle, waiting for the signal that the Xylos had accepted the handshake delivered by a tired old man and a broken surveyor. And now, because of Elson's pride, because of his stubborn refusal to let a machine read his maps, the deal was broken. You have created a vacuum, Commander, the voice resonated. The consensus requires the data you destroyed. Without the refuge coordinates, the harvest cannot be surgical. It will be absolute. The obsidian pillar stopped directly beneath their cells. It opened like a flower of cold metal, revealing a central interface that pulsed with a rhythmic violet light. We offer you a final choice, Quarry. Your navigator, Lyran Swayon, possesses a deep memory imprint of the Martian refuge locations. Her subconscious has retained what the computer lost. We can extract it. The process will be efficient, but it will erase the biological original. She will become a ghost in our network, and you will be allowed to return to Earth to witness the transition. Elson felt a scream building in his throat. Or you can refuse. We will discard the Human Alliance's proposal. We will treat your species not as a potential component, but as a navigational hazard. We will ignite your atmosphere to clear the system for our next transit. A timer appeared in the air, the numbers written in the blocky, institutional font of the Human Alliance Navy. 60 seconds. Elson looked at Lyran. She was staring at him now. She couldn't hear the voice, but she could see the choice in his eyes. She was 30 years younger than him. She was the one who had spent her life in the dark, and now he was being asked to turn her into a line of code or watch the entire world burn. Choice A. The surgical harvest. Lyran dies, the elite escape, and the billions in the bunkers are integrated into this cold obsidian nightmare. Choice B. The absolute end. Everyone dies, including the traitors in the Andes, and humanity ends as a scream in the vacuum rather than a whisper in a machine. There was no middle ground. There was no third option. The hard logic of the Xylos had stripped away the human capacity for a bluff. 50 seconds. Elson's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. He was in a cage of light, his ship was gone, and his body was being translated into information. He thought of the Chancellor's face in the recording. He thought of the billions of people who had no idea they had already been sold as scrap metal. If he chose the harvest, he was validating the betrayal. He was saying that the lie was worth the life. If he chose the fire, he was playing God with 8 billion souls. He looked at his hands, the blistered, scarred hands of a man who had hauled ice and patched leaks for 40 years. He remembered the drip of the coolant on the Odyssey. Drip. 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 The heartbeat of a species that was already dead and just didn't know it yet. He realized then that the paradox Valzeth had mentioned wasn't about strength or ideas. It was about the human inability to accept a losing hand. 20 seconds. Lyran pressed her hand against the translucent wall of her cell. She wasn't begging. She was waiting. She knew him. She knew that Elson Quarry didn't believe in grand gestures. He believed in the job. And the job was to protect the crew. He closed his eyes. "I won't give you Lyran," he said, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register of a man who had reached the end of his rope. "And I won't give you the refuges. 10 seconds. Then you choose extinction," the voice stated, devoid of emotion. "No, Elson growled. I choose to change the game. He didn't reach for the interface. He reached for the translation field itself. He had noticed the way the light cage hummed with his pulse. If his biological markers were being converted into data, then his very existence was currently a bridge between the physical and the digital. He focused on the static burn in his right arm, the 40,000 volts that had seared his nerves. He didn't fight the pain. He embraced it, pushing the memory of that agony into the feedback loop of the Xylo cage. He forced his mind to dwell on the chaos of the Odyssey's final moments. The smell of ozone, the scream of tearing metal, the sheer entropic disorder of a dying ship. He wasn't sending a key. He was sending a fever. 5 seconds. The Xylo ship was a masterpiece of order. It couldn't handle the raw, unfiltered input of a human mind in the middle of a nervous breakdown. The hexagonal prism began to flicker. The obsidian plates below groaned, their geometric precision buckling under a sudden, localized surge of entropic data. "Lyran!" Elson screamed, the sound finally breaking through the barrier. "Hold on." He didn't wait to see if she heard him. He threw the entirety of his consciousness into the surge, a suicidal burst of mental noise designed to crash the local subsystem. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The violet light in the pillar didn't just fade. It detonated. The translation process reversed with a violent, bone-snapping jolt. Elson felt his physical form being slammed back into reality, his boots hitting the obsidian floor as the cage vanished. But the victory was hollow. The feedback loop he had created didn't just crash the cage, it tore through the hangar's atmospheric containment. A wall of white light erupted from the center of the mothership as the internal gravity generators failed. Elson was thrown across the floor, his body tumbling toward the edge of the chasm. He saw Lyran's cell shatter, her body falling into the darkness of the ship's interior. And then, the mothership reacted. Valzeth's voice returned, but it was no longer a chorus. It was a roar of white noise. The Xylo fleet, 347 needles of obsidian, suddenly broke formation. They didn't move toward Earth. They turned inward, their gravitational drives flaring with a lethal intensity. The sabotage had triggered a defensive purge. The Xylos were no longer interested in the collection. To save the consensus from the infection of Elson's mind, they were initiating a hard reset of the entire sector. The light didn't just swallow the room. It began to peel the stars from the sky. Elson Quarry lay on the cold obsidian floor, his breath coming in shallow gasps of freezing air. He had saved Lyran from the machine, and he had stopped the trader's deal. But as he watched the Xylo fleet prepare to collapse the local spacetime into a singularity, he realized the cost of his choice. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy hum of the ship. It was the sound of a solar system beginning to fold in on itself. The bluff was over. The game was lost. And the fire was coming for everyone. The obsidian floor did not just crack, it dissolved into a frantic geometry of non-existence. Elson Quarry felt the sudden, sickening lurch of a world losing its fundamental constants. His ribcage groaned under the erratic pulses of a failing gravitational tether, each thud against the dark plating sending a jolt of white-hot agony through his shattered shoulder. He was a man of the belts, a veteran of pressurized cabins and the cold arithmetic of oxygen reserves. But nothing in 40 years of hauling ice had prepared him for the sound of a solar system being deleted. Lyran was gone. The darkness that had swallowed her was not a pit, but a deliberate erasure. He stared into the chasm where she had fallen, his vision swimming with the afterimages of the violent detonation he had caused. He had reached for a weapon and found only a torch to burn his own house down. The internal comms in his helmet crackled once, a dying burst of static that sounded like a name, or perhaps just the final gasp of the Odyssey's integrated telemetry. He reached out with his blistered left hand, grasping at the void, but his fingers met only the freezing, ionized air of a ship that no longer considered him a guest. He was alone in the gut of a leviathan that was preparing to vomit. High above, the 347 Xylo needles shifted. Their movements were no longer predatory, they were clinical. On his suit's failing heads-up display, Elson watched the energy readings for the Synthera system begin to spike into the impossible. The Xylos were not firing at Earth. They were collapsing the local gravitational manifold, a process that would turn every atom of the sector into a point of infinite density. It was a hard reset, A celestial format. And he was the virus that had prompted the command. He slumped against a jagged outcrop of obsidian, the cold of the alien metal seeping through the layers of his scorched flight suit. The industrial fatigue was absolute, a weight that pulled at his eyelids and slowed his racing heart to a sluggish, rhythmic throb. He looked at his hands, the skin blackened and peeling from the feedback surge. He had tried to be the hero. He had rejected the Chancellor's cowardly deal, thinking that a human soul was too precious to be traded for a seat at a machine's table. "I killed them," he whispered, the words lost in the thin, recycled atmosphere. "I didn't save the world. I just ensured there would be no one left to mourn it." The self-judgment was more caustic than the xylo radiation. He saw the faces of the billions in the bunkers, families huddled under the Martian crust, technicians in the Jovian clouds, all waiting for a message of hope. Instead, they would feel the sudden, inexplicable compression of their reality, a final second of confusion, before they were winked out of existence by a logic they couldn't even perceive. The Chancellor had been a traitor. Yes, but he had been a pragmatist. He had offered a future, however cold and hollow. Elson had offered only the fire of his own indignation. He felt small, pathetic, a grain of salt trying to stop the tide. The grand philosophy he had mouthed to Valzeth felt like the babbling of a child. Humanity wasn't a paradox. It was a mistake, a biological fluke that didn't know how to die with dignity. He closed his eyes, waiting for the singularity to take him, hoping that the end would be fast enough to outrun his shame. But the Xylo ship was not a perfect machine. A low-frequency vibration hummed through the obsidian beneath him. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of the purge, it was a stutter, a jagged, uneven skip in the ship's internal processing. Elson forced his eyes open, his military training clawing through the fog of his despair. He looked at the diagnostic slab still clutched in his left hand. The screen was a web of cracks, but a single line of text was scrolling across the bottom in the blocky green font of the Odyssey's secondary buffer. Redundant handshake pending. The signal booster. The jury-rigged, unstable piece of human garbage he had slaved to the reactor. It hadn't been completely incinerated. When the Xylo ship swallowed the Odyssey, a piece of the human vessel's core had been integrated into the hangar's local subnet. It was a ghost, a tiny, flickering remnant of Earth's primitive technology, lost in the vastness of the Xylo architecture, like a splinter in a giant's heel. The Xylos were purging the sector, but they were doing it through a centralized command. The stutter he felt was a synchronization error. The alien consensus was trying to align its gravitational drives, but the fever Elson had injected, the raw, entropic data of a dying human mind, was still echoing in the local nodes. It was a delay of perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes before the singularity became inevitable. It wasn't a way to save the world. It was too late for that. But it was a gap, a crack in the obsidian. Elson dragged himself toward the central interface pillar, his boots scraping against the deck plates. Every movement was a battle against the fading pressure in his suit. He reached the base of the pillar, where the violet light had been replaced by a dull, throbbing crimson. This was the throat of the Xylo network for this quadrant of the mothership. He didn't have the codes. He didn't have the hardware. All he had was the translation field he had broken. If he could reconnect himself to the pillar, he wouldn't be translated into a persistent informational state. He would be a carrier wave. He could use the stutter in the Xylo sync to piggyback a command. Not a command to stop the purge. The Xylos would override that in a nanosecond, but a command to redirect the energy of the gravitational collapse. It was a suicidal long shot, the kind of gamble that made seasoned commanders spit in disgust. He would have to open his own mind back up to the Xylo consensus, letting them peel back his thoughts and memories again, using his very consciousness as a bridge to force a local shunt. If he failed, he would die in a state of digital agony that would last for an eternity in the ship's accelerated timescale. If he succeeded, he might just be able to kick the mothership out of the sink, creating a localized bubble of stable space around the inner solar system. It wouldn't stop the Xylos forever. It would just buy time. A few years. Maybe a decade. A chance for the people in the bunkers to realize they were alone and try to find a way to fight. He looked at the interface. The red light pulsed, a countdown he couldn't read but could feel in his marrow. "I'm sorry, Loren," he thought, his hand hovering over the cold, glowing metal. I'm not doing this for honor. I'm doing it because I can't live with being the one who turned out the lights. He pressed his palm against the pillar. The connection was not a touch. It was a collision. A tidal wave of data slammed into his brain, a billion Xylo voices screaming in a language of pure mathematics. He felt his identity beginning to fray, his childhood memories of the lunar colonies being stripped away and replaced by the cold, vast history of 1,000 conquered stars. He screamed, but the sound was internal, a jagged spike of noise in a sea of equations. He forced himself to hold on to the image of the dripping coolant on the Odyssey. Drip, drip, drip. A human rhythm. A heartbeat of failure. He used that rhythm to anchor his mind, carving a path through the Xylo code. He searched for the synchronization trigger, the line of logic that told the 347 needles when to fire. He found it. It was a beautiful, terrifying sequence of prime numbers, a perfect architectural plan for extinction. He didn't try to rewrite it. He simply introduced a decimal point where there shouldn't be one. He injected the memory of his own pain, the sensation of his blistered skin, the weight of his grief. He turned his suffering into a mathematical variable. The mothership groaned, a deep, subsonorous roar that shook the very foundations of the chasm. The red light in the pillar flared to a blinding, chaotic white. An alarm began to resonate. Not a sound, but a sensory overwrite. Elson's vision turned to static. His skin felt like it was being flayed by a solar wind. The Xylo consensus had noticed the anomaly. The clinical entity that had spoken to him earlier returned, its voice no longer a whisper but a thunderous accusation. Commander Quarry, you are interfering with the necessary order. I know, Elson thought, his consciousness stretching until it was thin as a wire. That's what we do. He felt the gravitational manifold begin to buck. The Xylo needles outside were firing, but the energy was being diverted. The singularity was forming, but it was offset, the center of the collapse shifting away from the Earth's orbital plane. But the Xylos were not standing still. He felt a surge of counter-data, a digital executioner's blade swinging toward his mind. They were going to sever the connection by erasing the host. Elson gripped the pillar with both hands, his fingernails cracking against the stone. He had initiated the bypass, but he had to hold the line until the energy cycle peaked. He was a human fuse, and he was burning down to the nub. The hangar doors high above began to cycle rapidly, the vacuum of space clawing at the atmosphere of the chamber. Debris began to lift from the floor, swirling in a chaotic dance around the pillar. Elson felt his boots lose their grip on the obsidian. He was being pulled toward the chasm, held in place only by his desperate, agonizing connection to the machine. Then, a new icon flickered on his broken HUD. A signature, a life sign, faint and erratic, coming from the depths of the chasm below. Loren. She was still there. She hadn't been erased. But the singularity was seconds away from peaking. If he held the bypass, he would save the world but lose her to the collapse of the ship's interior. If he let go to reach for her, the Xylos would correct the sink and ignite the atmosphere of Earth. The red light of the pillar turned a deep, bruised purple. The air in the hangar was screaming as it rushed out into the void. Elson Quarry, the man who had spent his life hauling ice through the dark, looked down into the pit one last time. The choice was no longer about billions. It was about the girl in the dark. He didn't let go. He pushed harder. He poured the last of his biological life into the bypass, his heart hammering a frantic final rhythm against his ribs. The Xylo consensus roared. The needles fired. The universe turned into a single blinding point of white. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The white light was not the end. It was the friction of a single human mind burning through alien mathematics. Elson Quarry felt his consciousness stretched across the Synthera system. A thin, screaming wire connecting the broken pillar in the hangar to the 347 obsidian needles waiting in the void. He was no longer a man. He was a rounding error in a perfect equation. A jagged piece of grit in a machine designed to grind worlds into dust. The pain was no longer localized to his shattered shoulder or his scorched skin. It was systemic. Every time the Xylo consensus tried to synchronize the gravitational collapse, Elson slammed the memory of a freezing Saturnian night into the logic gate. He gave them the entropy of a dying engine, the chaotic rattle of a loose bolt, and the stubborn, irrational persistence of a man who refused to move. The interface pillar beneath his hands began to bleed heat. The cooling vents in the floor hissed with a frantic, high-pitched whistle, unable to dump the thermal load Elson was generating by forcing his biological electrical impulses into the Xylo subnet. High above, the internal defense systems of the mothership finally recognized the infection. A series of triangular apertures opened in the vaulted ceiling, and dozens of silver multi-jointed constructs descended on graviton threads. They didn't carry rifles or blades. They carried emitters that hummed with the frequency of neural erasers. Valzeth's voice returned, but it was stripped of its harmonic layers. It was now a singular, piercing tone of diagnostic necessity. "Your interference is an affront to the efficiency of the transition," the entity stated. "You are a component that has exceeded its operational lifespan. We will now remove the anomaly." Elson didn't look up. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the flickering green text on his shattered diagnostic slab, the only piece of home he had left. The redundant handshake was peaking. The signal booster on the remains of the Odyssey, lodged somewhere in the ship's lower intestinal tracts, was drawing the last of its battery life to amplify Elson's mental noise. In the belt, he thought, his teeth cracking under the pressure of his jaw. You don't fix a runaway reactor by asking it nicely. You choke the fuel lines. He reached into the Xylo network, not with the grace of a hacker, but with the desperation of a plumber. He didn't try to outcalculate the consensus. He simply took every memory of failure he had ever possessed. The smell of the leaking coolant, the sound of the Odyssey's aging hull groaning in hyperspace, the weight of the billions of lives he had almost surrendered, and he broadcast them as a universal constant. He forced the Xylo computers to treat human grief as a fundamental law of physics. The effect was instantaneous and violent. On his suit's tactical display, the 347 ships in the Synthera orbit began to wobble. Their gravitational tethers, normally locked in a perfect geometric grid, began to oscillate. The precision required to collapse a solar system was absolute. A deviation of even a fraction of a percent would turn the singularity into a chaotic mess of Hawking radiation. Elson gave them a deviation of 12%. The mothership groaned, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of his bones. The obsidian floor buckled as the internal gravity generators fought against the misaligned commands. The silver constructs descending from the ceiling were suddenly jerked sideways, slammed into the walls by a sudden surge of 300 gravities. They were crushed into unrecognizable spheres of crumpled metal in less than a second. "Earth is safe, Lyran," Elson whispered into his helmet, though he knew the comms were dead. But the victory was a jagged thing. The redirection of the energy didn't just stop the purge, it turned the mothership into a focal point for the very collapse it had initiated. The Xylo needles began to draw toward one another, drawn by an accidental localized black hole forming in the center of their formation. They weren't being erased. They were being pulverized by their own technology. A massive explosion rocked the hangar. One of the secondary power conduits in the wall ruptured, spewing a plume of violet plasma that turned the air into a searing furnace. The shockwave threw Elson back, finally severing his physical connection to the pillar. He flew through the air, a ragdoll in a vacuum, until his back slammed into a jagged piece of wreckage. The impact cracked his helmet's outer visor, and a thin, terrifying hiss told him his life support was now a countdown measured in seconds. He tumbled toward the edge of the chasm, his fingers scraping uselessly against the slick obsidian. He came to a halt inches from the drop, his legs dangling over the edge of the pit where Lyran had vanished. The hangar was a graveyard of sparking wires and dying machines. The violet light was gone, replaced by the flickering, angry orange of electrical fires. The Xylo consensus was silent. The noise had worked. The fleet was shattered, their synchronization broken by the sheer, unadulterated mess of a human soul. But the cost was written in the ruins around him. The Odyssey was gone, atomized in the initial surge. The signal booster was dead. And he was alone in the belly of a dying god, 400,000 kilometers from a home that would never know his name. Elson coughed, and a spray of blood clouded the inside of his visor. The air in his suit was growing heavy with carbon dioxide. He looked down into the chasm. The signature he had seen earlier, the faint, erratic pulse of Lyran's life sign, was still there. But it was moving. It was descending. She wasn't being saved. She was being pulled into the core of the ship as it began its final, agonizing tumble toward the Synthera moon. He had saved the billions, but he had traded the only person who mattered for a few years of borrowed time. He forced himself to sit up, his movements slow and agonizing. He looked at the diagnostic slab. It was dead. No more green text, no more handshakes. Just a reflection of his own battered face in the cracked glass. He looked like his father, a man who had died in a mining accident 3 decades ago, buried under a mountain of ice because a sensor had failed. The ship gave another violent lurch. Outside the massive hangar doors, which were now stuck halfway open, he could see the Synthera moon looming. It was a cold, dead rock, and they were going to hit it at 18,000 kilometers an hour. Elson Quarry, the man who had outbluffed a galaxy, reached for his belt. He found a single, emergency flare, a primitive magnesium stick designed for signaling in the dark of a mining tunnel. It was a pathetic tool, a relic of an era before FTL drives and gravitational manifolds. He struck the flare. The small, defiant spark of red light filled the hangar, reflecting off the obsidian walls and the twisted metal of the silver drones. It was a human fire, small and fragile and destined to burn out. He held it over the chasm, looking for a sign of her, a sign of anything other than the cold, calculated end he had earned. Far below, in the darkness of the pit, something moved. Not a machine. Not a Xylo construct. A hand. A gloved, human hand, reaching up from the shadows, illuminated for a fraction of a second by the red glow of his flare. Lyran. She was alive, but she was trapped in the internal venting system, her suit snagged on a cooling vane. Between them lay 100 meters of twisted wreckage, and a ship that was breaking apart in the atmosphere of a moon. Elson looked at the flare, then at the hand in the dark. He had no tools. He had no ship. He had no air. He was a man with a broken shoulder and a dying suit, standing on the edge of a literal and metaphorical abyss. The Xylo mothership hit the first layers of the Synthera atmosphere. The screaming of the wind against the hull began as a low moan and rose to a deafening shriek. The hangar began to glow with the heat of re-entry. Elson didn't close his eyes. He didn't wait for the end. He took the flare, tucked it into the utility pouch of his suit, and stepped off the edge. He fell into the dark, not as a commander, not as a hero, but as a man who knew that in the end, the only thing worth saving was the person right in front of you. The sky above Synthera turned into a streak of falling stars as the 347 needles of the Xylo fleet burned up in the atmosphere, a rain of obsidian glass falling onto a world that had never known war. And in the center of the fire, a single broken ship carried 2 humans toward a fate that the universe had forgotten to calculate. The screaming stopped first. It was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the cracked laminate of Elson Quarry's visor. There was no more atmospheric friction, no more grinding of obsidian tectonic plates, and no more synthesized voices of alien gods. There was only the sound of his own breath, ragged, shallow, and wet, and the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the cooling metal around him. It sounded like a funeral drum. Elson lay on his back in the gray, fine-grained dust of the Synthera moon. Above him, the sky was a bruised tapestry of violet and gold. The 347 needles of the Xylo fleet were gone, reduced to a long, shimmering trail of incandescent debris that streaked across the horizon like a scar that refused to heal. The pride of a billion-year-old logic was falling to the dirt as slag. He tried to move his left arm, but his nervous system sent back a notification of total failure. His shoulder was a ruin of shattered bone and cauterized flesh. He turned his head slowly, the movement dragging the jagged edges of his broken helmet through the regolith. 6 feet away, half buried in the wreckage of a hangar bulkhead that had served as their makeshift shield during the descent, was Lyran Swian. She wasn't moving. Her suit was coated in a layer of white frost, the internal heaters struggling against the absolute zero of the lunar night. Lyran, he whispered. The word didn't leave his helmet. The comms were a dead snarl of fried circuitry. He dragged himself toward her, his fingers clawing at the dust. Every inch was a tactical campaign, a negotiation with a body that had already decided to die. When he reached her, he saw the flicker of a single green light on her chest plate. The secondary life support was still cycling. It was the same low-voltage stutter he had seen on the Odyssey 3 weeks ago. A rhythmic, desperate pulse of survival born of absolute scarcity. He slumped against the metal beside her, his vision blurring. He looked up at the stars, searching for the pale blue dot that was Earth. But the glare of the falling Xylo wreckage was too bright. The Alliance would be watching the sensors in their bunkers under the Andes. They would see the gravitational signature of the Synthara system stabilize. They would see the Xylo fleet vanish from the tactical displays. They would check their spreadsheets, calculate the remaining oxygen in their atmospheric processors, and they would realize that the gamble had paid off. But no ships would come. Elson knew the logistics better than anyone. To send a recovery vessel across the Reach would cost 10,000 tons of deuterium, fuel the Alliance needed to keep the lights on in the refugee camps of Mars. To rescue 2 aging scouts was a mathematical error. In the cold, hard ledger of human survival, Elson Quarry and Lyran Swyon were already written off as acceptable losses. They were the scrap metal sacrificed to keep the machine running. He felt a strange, hollow peace in that realization. It was the final, honest transaction of a species that had learned to value the whole over the part. A shadow fell over them. Elson blinked, his eyes stinging from the salt of his own sweat. Standing 20 paces away was a shape that didn't belong on a dead moon. It was one of the multi-jointed Xylo constructs, its silver chassis blackened and twisted. One of its graviton legs dragging uselessly in the dust. It wasn't attacking. It didn't have its neural erasers powered up. It simply stood there, its sensors flickering with a dim, dying amber light. It was observing. Even in its death throes, the consensus was trying to understand. Elson reached out with his functioning hand and found Lyran's gloved fingers. He squeezed. After a long, agonizing silence, he felt the faint, answering pressure of her thumb. She was awake. She was watching the same falling stars. "You were right, Elson." Her voice crackled through a direct contact vibration as she leaned her helmet against his. One ship was enough. He looked at the broken alien machine, then at the wreckage of the Odyssey scattered across the crater. They had outbluffed a god with a leaking cooling loop and a handful of lies. They had forced a perfect logic to choke on the messy, irrational reality of human grief. It wasn't a heroic victory. It was a messy, desperate, and deeply flawed survival. The Xylo construct's amber light flickered one last time and went dark. It slumped into the dust. Just another piece of junk on a forgotten moon. Elson closed his eyes. The air in his suit was growing thick, the smell of ozone replaced by the heavy, sweet scent of carbon dioxide. He thought of the Chancellor in the dark room, the tax on air, and the billions of people who would wake up tomorrow without the shadow of an obsidian needle over their heads. They would never know his name. There would be no monuments, no parades, and no medals. Only the continued, grueling struggle of a species that refused to follow the equations. He felt the cold of the moon beginning to seep through the seals of his suit. A slow, inevitable encroaching of the dark. He didn't fight it. He held Lyran's hand and listened to the rhythmic tick of the metal, the final beat of the funeral drum that had followed him across the galaxy. The universe is a vast, cold machine that demands a perfect accounting. But for one brief, flickering moment, we made it lose its place. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science.